I was browse a matchmaking group chat when a woman posted, looking for a wife for her son. Her family had 53 rental properties, 3 villas, and 5 cars. She was offering a $10,000 monthly allowance for her future daughter-in-law. The only catch? Her son was in a vegetative state. I fell in love on the spot. This wasn't a man in a vegetative state, this was my sleeping prince. Prince, I'm coming for you. I joined a matchmaking group chat a while back, mostly just to fill a spot. I'd show up to their events to score some free food and drinks, help boost the numbers, and occasionally I'd scroll through the messages to keep up with the romantic drama of today's single millennials. There were also some older ladies in the group, trying to find partners for their kids. One of them dropped a bombshell that blew up the chat. She said her family had 53 rental properties, 3 villas, and 5 cars, with other assets not even included. It was all for her only son, and she would give her future daughter-in-law a $10,000 monthly allowance. The whole group went wild. Women popped up from everywhere, asking if it was for real. The woman confirmed it was, but added that her son was in a vegetative state and hoped the daughter-in-law wouldn't mind. The chat went dead silent. But me? I was ecstatic. Wasn't this a gift from the heavens? I had already decided I was never getting married. I had no strings attached and nothing to lose, so why bother? Even having a husband in a vegetative state was no big deal. My name is Ava, and I love money. I immediately sent a message, "Ma'am, what are you talking about? Your son isn't in a vegetative state, he's my sleeping prince." The chat exploded again with holy cow and clapping emojis. The woman quickly sent me a private message, "You have a great sense of humor, young lady. Are you really willing to marry my son? Please don't joke with me." I am. Why? For the money. I wasn't going to beat around the bush. I was in it for the cash. She went silent. I thought I'd disappointed her, but a moment later, she sent me 100. She said it was for my travel expenses and asked me to meet her at Villa 8 in the Starlight Bay Estates. She promised to give me a warm welcome. Starlight Bay Estates is the most exclusive villa community in our city, with prices starting at over $5,000 per square foot. This woman was seriously rich. I accepted the money without a second thought and headed out. When I got to Starlight Bay and found Villa 8, the sheer opulence of the place hit me like a wave. I actually felt a little nervous. I quickly smoothed my hair, straightened my collar, and rang the doorbell. A stunning woman in her 40s with a beaming smile opened the door. Rich people are just different. At over 40, she looked like she was in her early 30s. Her skin seemed even better than mine, and her fashion sense was impeccable. I shook her hand and introduced myself. "My name is Ava. I'm a local, graduated from a top-tier university, and I'm currently studying for the civil service exam." The woman looked me over, and her first impression seemed positive. Young, beautiful, a graduate from a great university, and a local. Very good. I offered a few humble words and followed her inside. She poured me tea and asked a lot of questions, mostly about my family and work. My parents divorced a long time ago and neither of them wanted me, so I was on my own. As for my job, I was a fashion designer making about $80,000 a year. The woman nodded repeatedly after hearing my answers and didn't ask anything else. Instead, she led me upstairs. "Are we going to see my sleeping prince?" I asked. She turned back and smiled. "Yes. He's my little sleeping prince, too." We went up to the 3rd floor and entered a bedroom. Honestly, I wasn't interested in her son. I, Ava, was only in it for the money. I would take care of him as required, but otherwise, he'd be a stranger to me. But the moment I saw him, I froze. My hormones went into overdrive. Holy cow, was he handsome. The long lashes resting on his closed eyes, the delicate features gracing his gentle face, the clearly defined collarbones on his long neck. This, prince, my prince. I never expected my sleeping prince to be so gorgeous, totally movie star level. I hadn't been interested in men for years, but now, I was very interested. Turns out, women really are suckers for a pretty face. The woman sat down, patting the prince's hand. She spoke to me softly, "Ava, this is my son, Daniel. His father died young, and I had always hoped he would grow up healthy and strong, but then, the car accident." Her eyes reddened as she said this, and she stared at Daniel in a daze. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. What a tragic story. I tried to comfort her. "Ma'am, maybe a miracle will happen. Daniel might wake up someday. We've been treating him for a long time. The doctors have diagnosed him as being in a permanent vegetative state." She looked like she was about to cry again. I shut my mouth, knowing there was nothing more I could say. After a while, she led me back downstairs. As we walked, she said, "Ava, if you don't have any objections, you can move in now. If you haven't changed your mind after 6 months, we can discuss the marriage." Now? That seemed incredibly fast. Yes. I've been away from my work in Beijing for too long and I need to get back. I'll have the butler and housekeeper assist you with everything. Just make yourself at home, as if you're the lady of the house, she said kindly. I glanced around the villa, thinking how huge and luxurious it was. Moving in here would be amazing. I agreed. "Since you trust me so much, ma'am, I definitely won't let you down." She smiled and nodded. "Good. You came here for the money, so I'll be doing a thorough background check on you. I hope you don't mind." She was a straight shooter. "I don't mind at all," I said. "Check whatever you want." She was very pleased. She shook my hand again. "Ava, you're a very generous and straightforward girl. I've met many potential daughters-in-law over the past 2 years, and none of them were right. You're the first. I'm leaving this place in your hands. All you need to do is talk to my son, keep him company. The housekeeper can handle everything else. I'll transfer your monthly allowance to you." I nodded enthusiastically. Understood, loud and clear. That very day, she left for Beijing, and I moved into the mansion with all my bags. The butler and housekeeper did indeed arrive, but they didn't have much to do and seemed quite relaxed. I chose the room next to Daniel's. It was sunny, spacious, and bright, perfect for sleeping and studying. After dropping my luggage, I ran over to see Daniel. He looked like a sleeping beauty, handsome from every angle. The more I looked, the more I thought what a waste it was. Such a perfect prince, and he was in a vegetative state. "Mr. Daniel, hello. I'm Ava, your future wife. I'll be taking care of you from now on," I said, introducing myself as I sat down and stared at his face. Naturally, he didn't react at all. I thought for a moment, then went to my room, booted up my computer, and started researching vegetative states. It turns out there are 3 types. The first is a minimally conscious state, where a person can cry, laugh, and hear people talking, but their consciousness is too weak to wake up. The second is a persistent vegetative state, where they can open their eyes unconsciously but are actually in a continuous coma. The last type is a permanent vegetative state, where there's no consciousness at all. Daniel was unfortunately the third type. I also looked up whether people in vegetative states can recover and found it's almost impossible. However, through wake-up therapy, constant massage, and vagus nerve stimulation, there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of a miracle. But a 1 in 10,000 chance is basically 0. How tragic. I almost feel guilty taking this money, I sighed, closing my laptop. Ahem. A soft cough startled me. It came from the next room. "Daniel?" I rushed over, thinking he had regained consciousness, but he was still the same quiet sleeping beauty. I scratched my head. I must have imagined it. Oh well. I should just focus on being a good daughter-in-law and collecting my allowance. There wasn't much else I could do. Just then, his mom transferred me 10,000. I grinned. From now on, I was going to be living high on the hog. With 10,000 from his mom in my account, I was in a great mood. It was only early evening, so I decided to get to work. By work, I mean chatting with Daniel, giving him massages, and helping him turn over. I was his future wife, after all, and I'd been paid. It was the least I could do, and I definitely wasn't just looking for an excuse to get a closer look at his handsome face. Definitely not. I walked into Daniel's quiet bedroom. Everything in there was well kept and cozy. The regular housekeeper wasn't allowed upstairs to avoid disturbing Daniel, even though he was in a vegetative state. I sat by the bed, once again amazed by his looks. How could a man be this beautiful? Daniel, you're a true work of art, I complimented him, then started chatting away, which was really just me talking to myself. Since he couldn't answer, I didn't need to pause. I rambled on from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche, from childhood to live, and finally, I asked if he minded if I checked out his abs. His silence was my permission. Just kidding. I'm not really interested in men, I added quickly, reaching out to help him turn over and massaging his arms and shoulders. I was clumsy, having only seen how to do it online. I only had a vague idea of what wake-up therapy, massage, and vagus nerve stimulation really meant. The whole routine took me half an hour. When I was done, I positioned Daniel comfortably on his back again. Honestly, taking care of someone in a vegetative state wasn't easy. Daniel was tall and heavy, and I was sweating after just one session. So, what do you think? I'm a pretty good wife, right? Don't worry, now that I've taken your family's money, I'll make sure you're comfortable, I said, tooting my own horn. Suddenly, I saw Daniel's eyelid twitch, like he was being stimulated in his sleep. I was shocked. I stared, wide-eyed, but he was back to being a quiet sleeping beauty. I even touched his eyelid, but there was no reaction. Must have been my imagination again. What a shame. After taking care of Daniel, I went downstairs for dinner. The housekeeper had already prepared the meal. A woman in her 50s, she served my soup and rice with meticulous care. I thanked her and asked while eating, "Ma'am, how long has your young master been like this?" "Almost 2 years now," she replied, all business and not particularly warm towards me. She had probably dealt with too many future daughter-in-laws. I was just the latest one. I was curious. "How many other fiancés have there been?" "6, she said, her tone still flat. That was a lot. I didn't mind. After a moment's thought, I said, "Daniel's been lying here for 2 years. It's absolute torture. Can't we take him outside for some fresh air?" The housekeeper paused. "Take him out for fresh air?" "Yeah. What if he's still conscious in there? Lying in bed all day is worse than being dead. Later, turn on all the lights in the villa, and I'll take him for a walk," I instructed her. She looked at me with surprise, then nodded. After I finished eating, the villa's yard was as bright as day. I noticed for the first time that there was an outdoor swimming pool on the west side, a small grassy slope on the east, a little bamboo grove in the backyard, and a rockery with a stream in the front. It was beautiful. "Ma'am, bring the wheelchair. Let's get Daniel into it and take him downstairs," I called out to the housekeeper. She came with the wheelchair, carefully putting on fresh shoe covers before entering Daniel's room. Together, we managed to move Daniel into the wheelchair and push him out into the yard. It was a perfect night with a bright moon and twinkling stars. The evening breeze was gentle and incredibly peaceful. I locked the wheelchair in place and started pushing him, introducing him to his own backyard. "Look at your swing set, the vines on it are so beautiful. And is that a diving board over there? You must have liked diving, huh?" I was quite a chatterbox, talking all the way to the swimming pool. I stopped and dipped my feet in the water. It wasn't cold. "The young master used to love swimming at night," the housekeeper said from the side. "He was always so cool and distant during the day, but he would smile when he was soaking in the water at night." "Oh," I nodded, then had a sudden idea. "Let's let him soak his feet. We can sit him on the edge of the pool." "I don't know, the water might be too cold," the housekeeper said worriedly. I waved her concern away. A person in a vegetative state has the same body as a normal person. It's his brain that's not working, not his body. That was a complete contradiction, since Daniel couldn't move at all. But the housekeeper was convinced. She helped me lift Daniel out and sit him on the edge of the pool. I sat next to him, letting his head rest on my shoulder, and used my feet to splash water on his legs, giving him a little foot-powered water massage. "Miss Ava, you can call me Mrs. Booth. I'll go take care of some things now," Mrs. Booth said, leaving us alone. I continued playing in the water with Daniel while looking at the moon and reciting a poem for him. "Daniel, let's work on our relationship tonight. Here's a line for you. May I be like the stars and you like the moon, so that night after night our lights may mingle and shine." The poor guy, of course, remained silent. I poked his cheek. "Smile for me." I was just teasing, not really expecting him to smile. But then, it seemed like the corner of his mouth twitched up, revealing a faint, charming dimple. My eyes widened. Holy crap, did he actually smile? But when I looked closely, he wasn't smiling. I poked him again. His cheek just indented with my finger, no dimple appeared. Still, this series of hallucinations was starting to mess with me. I shouldn't be having so many. So, could it be possible that Daniel wasn't the third type of vegetative patient? Maybe he was the second, or even the first. He could sense me. "Daniel, you're conscious, aren't you?" I asked, a little excited. I grabbed his face and squished it, staring intently. But he remained completely unresponsive. Just then, Mrs. Booth called out, "Miss Ava, I'm drawing a bath for the young master. Would you mind washing him?" I sputtered. "Me, give Daniel a bath? Why me? Can't the housekeeper do it?" I wasn't that comfortable with the idea. "The other maids have gone home. It's just me and Mr. Wang, the butler. If we were to wash the young master, our calloused hands would probably scrub his skin raw," Mrs. Booth joked. I thought about it and realized she was right. If I were Daniel, I wouldn't want Mrs. Booth or Mr. Wang bathing me either. How awkward would that be? "Daniel, I'm taking you for a bath. As a modern woman, I'm only after the money, not your body." I was being serious. I absolutely was not lusting after his body. His collarbones, his Adam's apple, his pecs, his abs. I wasn't interested in any of it. I wouldn't even peek. Speaking of which, I wonder if he still had abs after lying in bed for 2 years. It looked like Daniel smiled again, but when I focused, he wasn't. I had to hand it to him. It was like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can never simultaneously know a man's position and his smile. Mrs. Booth had the bath ready, and it was my turn to wash Daniel. It was a huge task, but I was surprisingly eager. After all, bathing a man this ridiculously handsome? I was definitely not getting the short end of the stick. Mrs. Booth came to help me push Daniel into the bathroom. The bathroom itself was absurdly luxurious. There was even a large screen TV mounted on the wall opposite the tub, so you could watch shows while you soaked. I loved it. I kind of wanted to hop in and binge watch a series myself. "Miss Ava, let's put the young master on the edge of the tub for now. I'll leave the undressing to you." "It wouldn't be proper for me to see the young master's body," Mrs. Booth teased. I nodded. I could handle it. After Mrs. Booth left, I gathered my courage and started to undress Daniel. He was pale and tall. Even though 2 years in bed had caused some muscle atrophy, he wasn't bloated at all. His figure was still quite lean. My face felt a little hot. I wanted to look but felt too embarrassed to stare, so I quickly got him into the tub. The tub was huge. I knelt beside it and started scrubbing him down, but then I realized my posture was less than graceful. It was like I was at a farm, scalding a pig. Daniel was the pig, and I was getting him ready for market. "Miss Ava, why don't you just get in and wash with him? I can clean up everything at once when you're done," Mrs. Booth suggested from outside the door. That was a good idea. Daniel was just in a vegetative state, so what was the big deal about bathing together? It was better than my current pig prepping technique. So, I got into the tub and soaked next to Daniel. The hot water circulated, steam filled the air, and everything was warm and cozy. It was so comfortable. Daniel's skin was also nice and soft. I even gave his arm a few squeezes and started chatting again. "Danny, don't be shy. I'm your wife. It's totally normal for me to bathe you." Honestly, I was the shy one. Daniel didn't respond. My eyes darted around, taking in more of him than I probably should have. I thought to myself gratefully, "Danny, thank you. The guy I crushed on for 5 years never let me see this much." After the bath, Mrs. Booth and I carried Daniel back to his bedroom. It was time for him to rest. But my mind was buzzing, all because of those hallucinations I'd been having. Daniel might actually be conscious. They weren't hallucinations. "Mrs. Booth, do you have a phone stand?" I asked her. She said she did and went to find one for me right away. Without wasting any time, I found a good spot by Daniel's bed, brought over a stool, set up the phone stand, and fixed my phone to it with the video recording on. Once it was positioned correctly, my phone was aimed right at Daniel, recording his every move. If he showed even the slightest reaction, my phone would catch it. "Hey Danny, I think you can sense me. Can you give me a little smile?" I whispered close to his ear, watching him closely. No reaction. I tried massaging him again, pressing some pressure points below his nose, but still nothing. It really was Heisenberg's uncertainty principle at play. I scratched my head and started to walk out of the room. But then, I clumsily kicked the corner of the bed, pretty sure I broke my pinky toe. The pain was so intense I started crying and screaming. Mrs. Booth rushed upstairs to see what was wrong. Tears were streaming down my face as I told her I'd kicked the bed. Mrs. Booth ran off to find some medicine. As I sat down on the edge of the bed, I saw Daniel's finger twitch out of the corner of my eye. It was still again in the next moment, but I saw it clearly. I was overjoyed. I quickly grabbed my phone and checked the recording. In the video, right when I screamed in pain from kicking the bed, Daniel's eyelids clearly fluttered. It looked like he was trying to open his eyes. He really was conscious. This time, I was certain. Forgetting the pain in my foot, I sent the video to Daniel's mother. A moment later, the stunning woman video called me, her face flushed with excitement. "Ava, did Daniel move?" He did. I even saw him smile earlier. He's definitely conscious," I declared confidently, feeling a huge sense of accomplishment. His mom was emotional for a long time, wiping away tears. "It's so strange. I come back to see him for a few days every month, and he never makes a sound. How is it that he's reacting now that you're here? You truly are my lucky star." Maybe it was just a coincidence, I laughed, telling her to come back and see for herself. "I'll be back tomorrow. Keep trying to make noises, see how Daniel reacts, and record it for me." "I haven't seen him smile in 2 years, she said, breaking down in tears. Seeing her cry like that, I naturally agreed to do whatever I could. After hanging up, I started recording again. Last time, my scream of pain made him move. This time, I just do it again. "Ah. It hurts so much. Honey, I think my toe is broken. It hurts so much," I yelled, bending over and watching Daniel intently. This time, Daniel didn't react at all. I scratched my head and kept yelling for a while, screams, howls, roars, I even threw in some moans for good measure. Still nothing. I was getting frustrated. I seriously suspected he knew I was faking it. I turned around and saw Mrs. Booth standing in the doorway, watching me with a strange look on her face. I looked at her, confused. "Mrs. Booth, what's wrong?" "Miss Ava, you're a true heroine. I can't believe you thought of such a stimulating method," she said with a smirk. It hit me, and my face flushed hot. What the hell was I doing, screaming "Honey, it hurts so much, ah." Over and over? A cat in heat doesn't wail like I do. I quickly explained the whole situation to Mrs. Booth, assuring her I wasn't having a breakdown. She got excited too. The young master is conscious? Quick, quick, keep yelling. How could I possibly scream anymore? Besides, Daniel wasn't reacting. My acting wasn't convincing him. But I wasn't ready to give up. I whispered a few words to Mrs. Booth. She looked at me in surprise, then hurried downstairs. I started recording again and sat by the bed, talking to Daniel. Come on, Danny, you have to move more. Don't be lazy. I know you can hear me. Before I could finish, the door was kicked open. Mrs. Booth burst in, brandishing a kitchen cleaver and slamming it against the doorframe, making a huge noise. I screamed, "Ah! Who are you? What are you doing?" I clung to Daniel's hand in terror, shrinking back and yelling hysterically. Mrs. Booth kept slamming the cleaver, her performance terrifyingly realistic. "I'll give you anything, just don't kill me," I sobbed, looking as pathetic as possible. Suddenly, I felt Daniel's fingers tighten around mine. He was squeezing my hand. The squeeze wasn't very strong, but it was there. Overjoyed, I looked at his face and saw his eyelids fluttering wildly, his lashes trembling as if he was about to force his eyes open. "Daniel, save me!" I shouted. Daniel's grip got tighter. I had no doubt that if he had the strength, he would have pulled me into his arms. Feeling the faint pressure of his fingers and seeing the struggle in his eyelids, I felt a strange sense of emotion. "Come on, Daniel, you can do it." I was desperate for Daniel to wake up. His fingers and eyelids were moving. He was worried about me. Mrs. Booth was giving it her all, practically destroying the door. We were both waiting for a miracle. But then, Daniel's fingers suddenly went limp again. His eyelids stopped moving. He was back to being a quiet sleeping beauty. My heart sank and I let out a sigh. This time, I don't think he figured out I was acting. He just genuinely couldn't wake up. After lying in bed for 2 years, moving his fingers and eyelids was probably his limit. I told Mrs. Booth to stop. She looked pretty disappointed, too, leaning on the cleaver. I leaned over Daniel and whispered, "The bad guy is gone. It's okay now, I'm safe." I don't know if it was just my imagination, but I felt him relax, even though he hadn't moved a muscle. Mrs. Booth spoke up. "Miss Ava, you're amazing. You've only been here a day and you've already gotten the young master to move. I think you should sleep in the same bed with him. It might have a miraculous effect." Mrs. Booth's suggestions were always so blush-worthy. But she had a point. Maybe I really was Daniel's lucky star. "Okay," I said. "Daniel is all clean and smells nice. I don't mind." Mrs. Booth chuckled and went to prepare a late-night snack for me. I sent the latest video to his mom. Once again, she lost it, crying her eyes out and wishing she could fly back immediately. I, on the other hand, felt pretty happy. Maybe this is what it feels like to help others? But then I remembered, I came here to make money. I'm a firm believer in not getting married. Having a husband in a vegetative state was perfect, I could spend his money all day. If he woke up, where would that leave me? Looking at the handsome Daniel, I had to accept my fate. I'd be a good person, just this once. After my snack, I cleaned up and got into bed with Daniel. He really did smell good, and he was so soft and comfortable to hug. It was a shame his abs and pecs had faded away from being bedridden. But I still thought he had a great body, top-notch. After everything that happened today, I felt much closer to him. He genuinely cared about me, and it had been a long time since I'd felt that from anyone. With no one watching in the middle of the night, I felt bold. I threw an arm and a leg over him and started chattering away. Talking was supposed to help wake him up. Somewhere in my rambling, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sun on my face and saw Daniel's mom sitting by the bed, looking at us with a gentle expression. I turned beet red and shot up, immediately untangling myself from Daniel. His mom chuckled. "Don't be nervous. You're Daniel's wife. There's nothing wrong with sleeping with him." I gave an awkward laugh and got out of bed to fix my hair and clothes. She had been back for a little while. She stroked Daniel's cheek, her eyes red again. If I hadn't been there, she probably would have burst into tears. I said I was going to go wash up. His mom stopped me. "Ava, I'm so grateful to you. I've also had your background checked. You've had a hard life, child. From now on, I'll give you $50,000 a month." Wow. My eyes practically turned into dollar signs. 50,000. Thank you, ma'am. I didn't hesitate. I was the young lady of the house now. 50,000 it is. His mom smiled. "My name is Rebecca. I really like you as my daughter-in-law. That's why I had your family's debts paid off. Your parents shouldn't bother you anymore." My heart skipped a beat, and I fell silent for a moment. She knew everything about my broken home, even paying off the debts. Now I wouldn't have to send money home every month, the $1,000 my mother demanded, the $1,200 my father wanted. It could all be saved. "Thank you, Mrs. White," I said again, then headed for the door. "I'm going to wash up. You should spend some time with Daniel." Mrs. White murmured her agreement and took Daniel's hand, calling his name softly. I went to brush my teeth and wash my face. After breakfast, I sat on the sofa for a long time, just zoning out. Mrs. White stayed for a week before returning to Beijing. During that week, I staged a few more dangers to get Daniel to react. Mrs. White was overjoyed and encouraged me to keep trying, to create a miracle. If it weren't for her business in Beijing, she probably would have stayed. And yes, she really did give me 50,000. Added to the previous 10,000, that was 60,000. In just a few days, I had made 60,000. Money was a great motivator. I tried all sorts of methods to stimulate Daniel. Faking an attack and screaming for help was my go-to move. I also developed other techniques, like pushing him in his wheelchair at high speeds, cuddling him in skimpy outfits while whispering sweet nothings, and taking him swimming. But screaming for help was still the most effective. He fell for it every time, getting so tense. I kind of liked seeing him get tense. Maybe it's because I'm someone who craves affection. It was pretty pathetic that I was finding a long-lost feeling of love from a man in a vegetative state. 2 months passed like this. Daniel's reactions grew stronger, but he could never manage to open his eyes, always getting stuck at the final hurdle. I didn't give up. Without realizing it, I had grown incredibly close to him, thinking of him as my husband. The feeling was strange but one I enjoyed. You could say that rather than me taking care of Daniel, it was he who was giving me a sense of being loved. One day, after giving Daniel his massage, I went back to my father's house because my grandmother was sick. Knowing my father wasn't home, I bought a lot of things for my grandma, left her a few $1,000s, and left quickly. When I returned to the villa, Mrs. Booth hurried me. "Ava, the young master moved again just now. It's the first time he's moved on his own. He was probably missing you." Missing me? I ran to see Daniel. He was indeed moving his fingers, just slightly. I interlocked my fingers with his, and he immediately became still and peaceful. Mrs. Booth marveled, "The young master probably got anxious because he hadn't seen you all day. He got so worked up he moved. Now that you're back, he's calm again." That made sense, and a warmth spread through my heart. Danny, don't be scared. I won't leave you," I soothed him, boldly giving him a kiss on the cheek. Mrs. Booth giggled and slipped downstairs. I got down to business, starting my daily wake-up routine. I started singing to Daniel, but after just one line, I heard a commotion downstairs. Mrs. Booth was questioning someone. "Who are you?" I frowned and went to the balcony to look down. My face fell. I saw my father. He had brought several relatives with him and was shoving Mrs. Booth. "Where's my daughter? What is she doing here?" I saw her go in. I instantly understood. My father had followed me. When I went to visit my grandmother, my father had been home the whole time. He just didn't show himself, choosing to follow me secretly. I had absolutely no desire to see him. I yelled down, "Dad, get the hell out of here." My dad looked up, saw me, and pointed, shouting, "You ungrateful brat. So you've married into a rich family, have you? Why did someone pay off my debt? And where did you get the money to give your grandmother? I bet she's some rich guy's mistress. Only rich people live here." One of my relatives chimed in, eyeing the villa. "Mrs. Booth, call the police." I shouted, turning back into the bedroom. Daniel was still lying there peacefully. I looked at his profile, listening to the shouting downstairs, and an overwhelming sense of grievance washed over me. My eyes instantly turned red. Mrs. White was right. I'd had a hard life. Though I was usually optimistic, thinking about my family still made me tremble. The beatings and verbal abuse that had been part of my life for over 20 years, the endless demands for money, and the immense struggles I faced just to get an education, it was all seared into my soul. I grabbed Daniel's hand, hoping for some comfort, but he didn't move. The shouting downstairs grew louder, followed by the sound of chaotic footsteps. My dad and his relatives were storming the house. I was shocked. I didn't think my father would be so brazen. I rushed to block the door, but it was too late. It was kicked open. My dad grabbed me by the hair and started yelling. "What are you hiding for? You're my daughter. Don't I have the right to know what you're doing?" He pulled so hard it felt like my hair was going to be ripped out. Tears streamed down my face. My relatives started in on me. "Your dad told us someone paid off his debts out of nowhere. Are you being kept by some rich guy? Get out." I screamed, pushing my father away through the pain. My dad saw Daniel on the bed, completely confused. My uncle went over to check. "Who's this guy? Is he the one who lured Ava away?" he asked, puzzled. "Get out. I've already called the police," I yelled, grabbing my phone. My dad shot back, "I'm here to see my daughter, the police can't do anything. This family tricked my daughter. Are you or are you not a mistress?" My dad and his relatives were locals and were convinced I was making money as a mistress. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong and weren't scared of the police at all. My teeth chattered. 20-some years of humiliation and suffering were being ripped open right in front of Daniel. "Get out." I didn't want to explain anything. All I could do was scream. Furious, my dad slapped me across the face, knocking me to the ground. "You're coming with me. What the hell have you gotten yourself into?" he yelled, trying to drag me out. My relatives were also getting ready to leave. Just then, my uncle cried out, "Holy crap, you scared me." My dad and the others looked over. My uncle pointed at Daniel. "This guy just opened his eyes. He's not in a vegetative state." Through my anger, I felt a surge of hope. Daniel opened his eyes? Daniel opened his eyes. While my dad was distracted, I scrambled free and looked at Daniel. His eyes were open, brighter than the stars, and fixed on my dad and his relatives. My family looked at each other, completely baffled. At that moment, police sirens wailed outside, and Mrs. Booth came charging up with a kitchen cleaver. "The police are here. All of you, stop right now." Mrs. Booth had secretly called them. "Good, let them come. They can investigate why my daughter was tricked into coming here." My dad, full of bluster, led his relatives downstairs to meet the police. I ran to Daniel's side. Not only were his eyes open, but he was trembling all over, his hands shaking violently. He was even angrier than I was. "Danny, wake up," I said, wiping my tears and looking at him with hopeful eyes. He was still trembling. I grabbed his hand and leaned down to hug him, holding on tight. "Husband, wake up." I called him my husband. I had said it many times over the past 2 months, mostly to tease him, but this time, for some reason, I said it with all my heart. It was as if this man, who had never spoken a word to me, was already my true husband. Hiss, a tiny sound escaped Daniel's lips. I saw a vein throbbing in his temple, fast and intense. I kissed him, not even knowing where the impulse came from. Daniel shuddered. I heard him breathing, taking deep, forceful breaths. But he still didn't wake up. It was like he was trapped in a dark space, able to feel my every move but unable to break through. I pulled away and shouted, "I'm leaving. I'm leaving and not coming back." I ran out of the room to the doorway. I could hear my dad complaining to the police, demanding they take his side. "Dad, you're just greedy. You don't care if I'm a mistress, you just want more money." I screamed. "Fine. I'll give you money. I've already made 60,000. You can have it all." My dad actually ran back in and pointed at me, roaring, "Ava, do you have any idea how hard it was for me to raise you? You think you can just fly away now? Go on, hit me. I dare you. I'll fight you." I had lost it. Right now, I had only one thought: wake up Daniel. Maybe after 20-some years of pain, Daniel, the man who couldn't speak, had become my emotional anchor. My dad, furious, rushed at me and started slapping me hard, too fast for the police to stop him. He hit me so hard my mouth filled with blood. I was dizzy, clinging to the doorframe to stay upright. My dad kicked me again, just like he used to when I was a kid, lashing out whenever he was upset. "I'll kill you, you ungrateful brat. You're making me so angry." He raged, showing no mercy. I couldn't stand anymore and collapsed to the floor. The police and my relatives rushed up, telling him to stop. But he wouldn't stop. He pinned me down, ready to hit me again, but then he let out a sudden yelp and scrambled backward. He was staring at the bed. Through my tear-filled eyes, I looked over and saw Daniel sitting bolt upright, staring daggers at my father. The police restrained my father, then jumped in shock when they saw Daniel. Mrs. Booth rushed over, shouting, "The young master is awake. The young master is awake." I passed out. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. Mrs. Booth was by my side. She'd been there all night. I was groggy and my whole body ached. Mrs. Booth's face lit up. "Ava, you're awake." I tried to speak, my throat dry. "Where's Daniel?" I asked weakly. "He's awake. Your father and his family were arrested. I notified the madam to come back. I don't know what happened after that. I brought you to the hospital and haven't left," Mrs. Booth explained briefly. I lay there and tried to smile, but my mouth hurt too much. Mrs. Booth said with concern, "Your father is too brutal. No one should treat their daughter like that. Don't worry, the madam is furious. She definitely won't let him get away with it." I didn't want to talk about it and stayed silent. Mrs. Booth dropped the subject and stayed with me, saying that Mrs. White would surely come to visit. But 3 days passed, and Mrs. White never came. Instead, Mr. Wang, the butler, showed up. He hadn't been at the villa that day. He apologized first and asked about my injuries. "I'm fine. How is Daniel?" My only thought was of Daniel. "The young master is gradually regaining consciousness. We believe he'll make a full recovery soon. He can already say a few simple words and drink porridge," Mr. Wang said excitedly. Mrs. Booth clapped her hands. "That's wonderful. This is a happy ending for everyone. The young master is awake, and Ava will be the young mistress of the house." I smiled, but a strange nervousness crept into my heart. What was an awake Daniel like? And did I love him? I was a firm believer in not getting married. And did he love me? Technically, he didn't even know me. As my mind raced, Mr. Wang hesitated. "The villa has been bustling with activity these past few days. I can't tell you how many people have come to congratulate the young master on waking up. A lot of rich young ladies have come, too. I recognized one of them as the young master's ex-girlfriend. What are you trying to say? Mrs. Booth demanded. Mr. Wang glanced at me and gave a dry laugh. The madam probably never expected the young master to wake up. He's the heir to a huge fortune. Now that he's awake, he'll inherit everything. I imagine the madam will want to find him a wife from a similar background. A chill went through me. I instantly understood why Mrs. White hadn't come to see me. It made sense. Daniel was undoubtedly one of the wealthiest men in our city, and his family had a massive business in Beijing. And me? I was just a girl from a broken, unfortunate family. With Daniel awake, my status had plummeted. It was a harsh reality. I turned my head away and said nothing. Mrs. Booth forced a smile. Ava, the madam really likes you. You're an excellent person. She's just been too busy these past few days to come over. Let's just wait a little longer. I didn't say a word. Mr. Wang sighed softly and left. I stayed in the hospital for another week until I was finally discharged. Mrs. White never showed up. Even Mr. Wang stopped coming. Mrs. Booth went back to the villa once but never returned, probably because Mrs. White told her not to. A different maid brought me a bag, saying it was my compensation. Inside the bag, I found a bank card and a small note. Ava, there's $1 million on this card. The PIN is 223451. I am so grateful for everything you've done. Truly, thank you so much. I hope we meet again someday. The note wasn't signed, but I knew it was from Mrs. White. I tucked it away safely and went to eat hot pot with a cheerful spring in my step. The steaming hot pot represented my new life. $1 million. I could buy a condo, get a dog, and pursue a job I actually liked. Oh, and I could study for the civil service exam without any financial worries. This was awesome. 2 months of work, and I got a comatose guy's mom to give me $1 million. Ha! In my excitement, I burned my tongue on a piece of tripe. And in that instant, I started to cry, my vision blurring. It was just so hot. A couple of weeks later, I moved into my new home, a luxury condo that cost me over $300,000. I finally had my own place. I still had $700,000 left, which, at my spending rate, I would never run out of. This was my security. My parents never bothered me again, likely because Mrs. White had given them a formal warning. I was very grateful to her for that. All in all, I came out way ahead. I hadn't lost a thing. I tried not to think about Daniel. We were from 2 different worlds. Now that he was better, he deserved to live his own wonderful life. Right now, I had one goal: pass the civil service exam and get a stable government job. My days were filled with nothing but eating, sleeping, and studying. I studied like a maniac, burning the midnight oil, because if you're not hustling, you're not living. Finally, after about half a year, I succeeded. I passed the exam for a position at the local Social Security office. It was just a job helping people with their Social Security benefits, but I was pretty happy with it. One step at a time. That night, I went out for hot pot to celebrate. And I burned my tongue on the tripe again. I paused, remembering how I had bawled my eyes out 6 months ago. For a moment, I was lost in thought. Why did I cry last time? Even a child wouldn't cry over that. So weird. I looked down, and tears started falling again. This damn tripe. After finishing the hot pot, I suddenly felt adrift. I had $700,000 and a stable job. I had everything I wanted in life. On a whim, I hopped on a bus and went to Daniel's villa. The villa was brightly lit. I walked along the sidewalk in the neighborhood, my eyes fixed on the window of Daniel's room. I knew that window so well. Daniel and I used to stand there together, enjoying the evening breeze, though he always nearly crushed me. I stared for a long time, not sure what I was hoping to see. The window remained empty. I decided to leave, but just then, a figure appeared in the window, a tall, handsome, serious-looking man. He glanced out, probably just looking around randomly. As luck would have it, he saw me. Our eyes met, and I froze. It was Daniel. He seemed to freeze too, a look of confusion on his face as he stared at me without blinking. My heart pounded in panic. I turned and ran. I fled the neighborhood, but Daniel didn't follow. Maybe he lost me, or maybe he didn't recognize me at all and had no reason to chase me. I walked home in silence, a heavy feeling in my chest. Today was supposed to be a day for celebration, but I felt like I had lost my soul. I slept poorly that night, plagued by chaotic dreams. When I woke up, my pillow was damp. I looked outside, it was already afternoon. I sat up, dazed, not knowing what to do. Maybe I should go to the Social Security office to report for duty? As I was thinking, there was a frantic knock on the door. I opened it and was shocked to see Mrs. Booth. I stood there, stunned. Mrs. Booth grabbed my hand, her voice urgent. "Ava, it's terrible. The young master has fallen into a coma again. The doctors say he's in a vegetative state." I gasped, "How is that possible? He was fine yesterday. He was rushing downstairs too quickly and fell yesterday. He was running like a madman and hit his head, there was so much blood," Mrs. Booth said, her voice filled with pain. My heart dropped. Was Daniel trying to chase after me yesterday? What an idiot. How could he fall down the stairs? "Take me to the hospital," I said without a second thought, grabbing a jacket and heading out the door. Mrs. Booth took me to the hospital. The hallway outside Daniel's room was packed with people. They were all rich and influential, there to visit Daniel. They peered down the corridor, and among them were many young, beautiful socialites. Mrs. Booth led me straight into the hospital room, drawing many surprised looks. Inside the room, I saw Mrs. White. Her eyes were red and swollen. She sat by the bed, holding Daniel's hand and sobbing uncontrollably. My own chest tightened as I looked at Daniel. He was still so handsome, a quiet sleeping beauty. I felt like I was going to cry, too. Why did this have to happen? "Madam, I've brought Ava." "Let's have Ava try to wake the young master," Mrs. Booth said. Mrs. White turned to look at me, her expression a complex, indescribable mix of emotions. I paid her no mind. I walked over to the bed on my own and leaned down to speak to Daniel. "Husband, I'm back. Wake up." Daniel didn't react at all. Mrs. White was crying so hard that Mrs. Booth had to help her out of the room, leaving me alone. I gripped Daniel's hand tightly and buried my face in the covers, sobbing. It was all my fault. I never should have gone back to see him. As I cried, Daniel's fingers twitched, and then he gripped my hand tightly. Overjoyed, I looked up. Not only was he holding my hand, but his eyes were open, and he was looking at me with a smile. It was so vivid. I was confused. "Daniel, you're supposed to call me husband." "Say it one more time and that'll make it an even 100, Daniel said, his voice clear and bright. He was awake. What happened?" I was at a complete loss, not knowing where to look. "I was faking it, you silly girl," Daniel said, lifting my hand to his lips. "You're finally back. I still remember your poem, 'May I be like the stars and you like the moon, so that night after night our lights may mingle and shine.'" I couldn't describe how I felt. I just collapsed onto his chest and cried my heart out. This was the first real conversation we'd ever had, yet it felt like we were an old married couple. "Don't cry. Listen to me. The doctor and I are in on this together. I'm going to pretend to be in a vegetative state, and you're going to keep taking care of me. At the same time, get my mom to arrange our wedding. Once we're married, I'll stop pretending," Daniel instructed. I blinked. He immediately closed his eyes and went still. Just then, Mrs. White came back in, still crying. "Ava, did my son react at all? The doctor said it's even worse than last time." Can you wake him up? I wiped my tears, composed myself, and said tragically, Mrs. White, I tried my best. Daniel isn't reacting to me at all anymore. Mrs. White nearly fainted. 3 days later, we were back at the villa. Daniel was home, and I was continuing to care for him. Mrs. White was listless, consulting with the doctor every day. The doctor said there was nothing he could do and offered a superstitious suggestion. Why don't you try to ward off his bad luck with a happy event? His luck has been terrible, first the car accident, now falling down the stairs. How do we do that? Mrs. White grasped at the last straw. I heard from Mrs. Booth that you found a wife for Daniel. Why not hold a wedding? A wedding is the best way to bring good fortune, the doctor said, spouting nonsense with a straight face. But Mrs. White actually believed him and started to consider it seriously. I was eavesdropping from upstairs. I glanced back into the bedroom at Daniel. He was sitting up, gesturing for me to go down and help things along. I immediately went back to my room, packed my suitcase, and dragged it downstairs. When Mrs. White saw me with my luggage, she was shocked. Ava, where are you going? I said apologetically, Mrs. White, I have to go to Shanghai for something. I'm sorry. Mrs. White's face paled. You're not staying? I'll give you 100,000 a month, how about that? She pleaded. It's not about the money. I don't need money anymore, I said, shaking my head. Mrs. White grabbed my hand, tears streaming down her face. Ava, I was wrong last time. Please don't go. Daniel only reacts to you. Please try again. I know you can wake him up. I remained silent. Frantically, Mrs. White said she would arrange for me and Daniel to get married right away, that we'd go get the license now, that she would never send me away again. Mrs. Booth also popped up to persuade me. Ava, if you leave, how will the young master survive? With you here, there's hope. You're the only young mistress I'll ever accept. Ava, don't go. I'll arrange your marriage to my son immediately. I'll invite everyone to witness it. Mrs. White promised. I sighed. All right. And so, a grand wedding was held. The villa was decorated like a dream, and the guests were all wealthy and influential. They gave me strange looks, but I couldn't care less. Daniel and I were secretly enjoying ourselves. On the wedding night, Daniel twitched his finger, making sure Mrs. White saw it. This made her ecstatic. She immediately said the good luck wedding had worked. I giggled to myself. A couple of weeks later, I convinced Mrs. White to go back to her work in Beijing, telling her not to waste any more time and that I would let her know the second Daniel woke up. So she left for Beijing. As soon as her car was out of sight, Daniel sat up in bed and started rummaging through a cabinet. I watched him, confused. Aren't you going to kiss me first? What are you looking for in the cabinet? Daniel turned around, holding his ID card and birth certificate. Let's go. Time to get our marriage license. We had the wedding, but we hadn't made it official, because you can't get a marriage license with someone in a vegetative state. Are we really getting married? I looked at him, feeling a little shy. Daniel lifted my chin. What's wrong? You think we don't know each other well enough? Yeah, it feels weird, I said, pushing his hand away. He pulled me into his arms. You might not know me that well, but I know you completely. In my darkest days, you were the light that shone through. I listened to you talk every day, felt your touch, and oh, I heard your bizarre screams. Sometimes, I thought you were quite a pervert. My face flushed red. That was just to stimulate you. It's a medical technique. Thank you for the stimulation. I remember it vividly. So please, marry me. I don't think I can live without your stimulation for the rest of my life, Daniel said, his words completely absurd but utterly sincere. It was so absurd. But I liked it. So I went with Daniel to get our marriage license. I guess I was trapped for life. So much for my no marriage stance. 2 years later, Daniel and I visited the place of his nightmare, the scene of his car accident. Standing on the curb, Daniel pointed to a spot not far away. That's where it happened. I thought I was going to die right there. Today is the first time I've had the courage to come back and look. I blinked, looking around, and asked with surprise, were you driving a Porsche back then? A red one? Yeah, how did you know? Daniel looked at me, amazed. I was even more surprised than he was. It was you. I was passing by on a Lime bike. I was the one who called the ambulance for you. You were covered in so much blood I couldn't see your face. Daniel's eyes went wide. That was you? When I was drifting in and out of consciousness, I felt someone come over, but I thought I was hallucinating. What a coincidence. I flipped my hair back and playfully took credit. So, Daniel, it turns out you owe your life to me. Shouldn't you repay me with, say, a 20-pound diamond ring? Daniel pulled me into an emotional hug. Miss Ava, a 20-pound diamond is hard to find, but how about a 150-pound man? I guess you'll have to do. You're pretty valuable yourself. Good. Then tonight, I'll start repaying you with everything I've got.